Hi, my name is Meredith, and I'll be doing my capstone on defining rape in terms of coercion, and that is just a picture of me since we haven't had in-person classes. To start off, I'll be analyzing the use of coercion and sex in this project. The current definition of rape defines it in the context of non-consensual sex, with the key focus being on the aspect of consent. I believe that rape should be defined in terms of coercion, which would include the non-consent factor, as well as other possible uses of manipulations of power by the aggressor. Coercion obviously undermines an individual's ability to validly consent to an encounter because they're no longer given free choice. Sexual coercion in this paper will be defined as the use of asymmetric power that one sort of agent may hold over another sort based on the former's ability to inhibit broadly the ability of the latter to act. So basically, the aggressor holds any sort of power over the other person, which would inhibit them to consent, whether that power be use of deception, coercion, any harmful tactic. The moral wrong committed by the aggressor is an important factor to be considered in rape cases because a lot of times the way that rape cases are handled can turn to victim blaming, which is a problem within the legal system and morally, which is why I believe the current definition of rape is insufficient in encompassing all the harms of these cases and leads to many rape victims not getting justice for the harms done to them. And some of the harms that will be focused in later sections include whether lack of response means yes, the gender inequality created by society, which is reinforced by this definition of rape, and the injustices that are not prosecuted, and the moral wrong of actions of the aggressor. And I will argue that defining rape in the context of coercion will help to conceptualize the moral wrong that occurs in these cases and aid in the rightful prosecutions necessary following these events. Review of established views. So the first definition of rape in the United States was centered around the common law definition that was focused on protecting a woman's virtue. It made it illegal to have sex with a woman who was not one's wife through the use of physical force or threat, which obviously leaves out marital and relationship rape. So it did not protect married women, men, or people threatened by non-physical threats. It also required, previous laws also required proof that the victim attempted to resist their aggressor, so it would have to be proven that they did not just submit to the force by their aggressor. The most up-to-date definition by the Department of Justice defines it as the penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. So this updated definition has been expanded to include both sexes as well as incapacitated victims. But obviously the key defining component of this definition is still the lack of consent of the victim. And this is the federal definition, but it is up to each state to create their own laws. These cases are not handled federally. And this definition falls short in protecting victims who they knew their rapist, and in a lot of these cases, it is less likely for them to be able to prosecute the aggressor. And it can also lead to victim blaming. So one debate about redefining rape is whether yes means yes or no means no approach is more effective. These are two mantras that became popular in the late 1990s. The no means no left a gray area for what happens when a no is not given, when the victim remains silent, and in turn, it supports the idea that if someone did not say no, then that they are saying yes. Whereas the yes means yes approach advocated in California and in New York that any sexual activity that occurs without the verbal consent of both parties can be charged as sexual abuse. The requirement of this verbal confirmation means that remaining silent or lack of saying no by either party does not qualify as consent, which can be a harsh standard to live up to in some relationship cases and marital cases, etc. There are two other proposed models for how to redefine rape in legal terms. The first being consent-based model, which is used in many European countries and is centered around the positive sexual autonomy of an individual, which is sexual autonomy that gives individuals the moral right to freely choose what happens to their body sexually. And this model would exemplify the importance of both parties to freely choose whether they'll engage in the activity. In contrast, the coercion-based model would seek to deprioritize consent as the key factor. It has been reflected in the Michigan Criminal Code, which defines rape with elements of force, coercion, threats, both physical and non-physical, and engaging in sexual activity with an incapacitated person. This model appeals to the negative sexual autonomy of an individual, which gives the individual the right to protection against situations that would harm their sexuality, with the goal being to focus on the moral wrong committed by the aggressor in order to induce the sexual activity that occurred, as opposed to focusing on the role of the victim, which can lead to victim blaming. This would also allow for the morality of the actions committed by the aggressor to be better evaluated instead of focusing on whether the victim's moral right was violated or not. The updated federal definition of rape falls short in these several areas because it makes it harder for victims to obtain justice. It can be hard to obtain evidence that their consent was not valid. Also, using words such as valid and consent can be challenging because of different ways people may interpret them. Defining rape in terms of consent places the focus on the actions of the victim again by trying to determine whether the victim could freely consent under her positive right. The case is more focused on how the victim would have reacted to the whatever force the aggressor used, whether physical or non-physical. Under Kantian ethics, individuals that seek out sexual relations by manipulating their power over the victim is simply using that individual as a means to an end. It has been well analyzed by the philosophical community that a victim cannot give their free consent under these circumstances. Coercion overwhelmingly influences those who are affected by it, and they make this decision to engage in the activity as opposed to a less favorable outcome. The coercion definition of rape makes it simpler to conceptualize and puts the focus of the harm into perspective to help get justice for the victim. Taking away the requirement as well to prove non-consent will give more power to the victims in these situations, because instead of requiring this proof, it then becomes more of a power to the victim because they can use it as an affirmative defense that will be available to them in the case. Additionally, through this conceptualization of the consent-based model, it can reinforce the gender hierarchy because the model emphasizes positive autonomy of one's body, which does not place the focus on the moral wrong committed by the aggressor, leading to, as stated previously, victim blaming. Women have been told by society that their pleasure is not as important as a man's. And the majority of historical sexual abuse cases in the United States, the aggressor has been a male and the victim has been female. And many people have claimed that rape occurs because of men's inherent sexual aggression and women's natural tendency to be acquiescent. The whole boys will be boys argument, which this view has supported several myths about rape for many, many years. Although this model is supported by historical ideals that women should submit to men and not seek their own sexual pleasure, it also reinforces the victim-blaming system surrounding the idea of rape. Women will often be questioned in these situations about what they were wearing, if they knew the person previously, their history with this man, and questioning these women after they've experienced this trauma can be even more traumatizing and places it in their minds that they could somehow be responsible based on their reaction to the aggressor's manipulation of power over them. And obviously the boys will be boys argument gives the illusion that men are unable to control their actions, and this is an excuse for their actions against women. Men are often given lesser sentences when the women questioned have been wearing revealing clothing or had a sexual history, either with the man or seemingly promiscuous with other men. Also, it's hard to determine whether a person's consent was undermined because people have different limits to what pressures them. In these cases, the men are aware of their power over these women and use it as a manipulation. Given how coercion was previously defined in the previous section, individuals who use the coercive force do so because they know that the victim will be worse off if they do not go with their proposed, or not proposed, but their threat, which is what makes it manipulative. And additionally, this would cover case of deception as well under this definition, because the aggressor has the knowledge of the truth, which gives them the power over the victim. This knowledge of the truth is their power in this case. The moral wrong of the aggressor should be the focus of these definitions in order to make better prosecutions, and it would lead to more women reporting their experiences because they would feel that they would not have to deal with the feeling that they could be at fault in some way. Potential objections to this definition. Some have argued against the elimination of defining rape through the use of consent. They argue that without an explicit mention of consent, the definition lacks the component of the right to moral autonomy. The response to this objection would be that the concept of consent is inherently built into the definition of rape that is conceptualized through coercion terminology. As stated previously, through the asymmetric use of power, consent is built into that definition. When you define rape using this terminology, it will automatically expose the moral wrongdoing of the aggressor, because the aggressor has a higher degree of power than the victim, whether this power be deception, coercion, physical force, any of the above, that the aggressor might manipulate his victim to acquire his means. Others have argued that the definition should involve the consent terminology because they argue that coercion can be subjective, and by subjective that means that coercion, what might be coercive to some people might not to other people, so it can mean different things to different people. But the argument against this is that there can be many different ways to coerce someone, but the way that the coercion affects the victim will be the same. So the aggressor what makes the aggressor be using coercion is the fact that they have this power over it, that victim that they are aware of, and they know that this is coercive to that individual person. That makes sense. The problem with the yes means yes model is that yes is not equivalent to consent, and an individual might say yes without validly consenting because of a potential abuse of power. The problem with the no means no model is that the individual does not have to verbally say no in order for their consent to not be given. There are other ways that people may communicate this. To wrap it up, this definition using coercion would encompass the consent aspect implicitly from the analysis of moral theory, as well as other manipulations of power by aggressors, such as deception and force. The current way that rape is conceptualized does not allow for the accurate conceptualization of the moral wrongdoing surrounding the encounter. The way that rape is handled in the United States and other countries supports myths about rape that have existed for many years across the world, and is often downplayed because of the way society views women's sexuality and men's inherent aggressiveness. And rapists should not be excused under the guise that they are inherently aggressive or because of the actions of a female. Thank you for listening.